Thank you, Nick. My name's Shelby Cunningham, and like Nick said, I'm just going to save questions for the end since this is the last talk of the day. If folks need to leave, I want them to be able to leave, and if folks want to stay and ask questions, I'm going to be around for a while after the talk to answer people's questions. And I will be answering questions in person and any that are read to me from the Discord. And now that it's a few minutes after 4:30 and folks have had time to get settled in, I'm going to get started telling you why exploit maturity is the metric that's going to be your new best friend in CVSS 4.0. Uh, First, I'm going to get started with a bio and why you should listen to me when I talk about CVSS 4.0. Next, I'm going to go into CVSS 3.1 versus 4.0 a little bit, but because there have been a lot of CVSS 4.0 talks today and people have gone over CVSS 3.1 versus 4.0 over and over again, I'm going to try to keep that part brief. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the exploit maturity metric is, specifically the exploit maturity metric in CVSS 4.0. I'm going to talk about two cases where you can use exploit maturity to improve the quality of your records. Those scenarios are correcting overscoring that tends to happen in CVSS 4.0 and to improve the record by including information about the exploit status right in the CVSS record with no other information necessary. All right. Who am I? Why should you listen to me whenever I talk to you about CVSS 4.0? As someone who works on GitHub's advisory database, I have to curate a lot of CVE records in order to generate the information that leads to Dependabot alerts. So as a result, I see a lot of CVSS scores. I see a lot of CVSS 3.1 scores. I see a lot of CVSS 4.0 scores. I see myself comparing them a lot of the time and thinking, could this be better? And which CNAs seem to be engaging in which practices. So I see a lot of other people's CVSS scores, but as part of my duties on the GitHub Advisory Curation team, I also do tasks related to GitHub's duties as a CNA. One of the services that we provide as a CNA is that when maintainers who use GitHub's CVE request feature don't want to score a CVSS or they don't know how to, that is something that we will do for them before submitting the CVE record to the CVE list. So I find myself having to score a lot of CVSSs for a lot of other people's products, and I have to consider what have other CNAs done, what would the maintainer want, what does the downstream consumer want to see. So these are all things I have to take into account whenever I'm doing a CVSS score. And I've seen situations where exploit maturity helps maintainers get their message across about how serious a particular vulnerability is, which is why I like exploit maturity. And I will move on a little bit to discuss what I am planning to cover and what I am not planning to cover. I am planning to cover specifically what the exploit maturity metric is. That is the exploit maturity metric in CVSS 4.0. There is a metric called exploit code maturity in CVSS 3.1. That is a little bit different, and I am not going to talk about exploit code maturity from CVSS 3.1 because it doesn't have the same impact on a CVSS that exploit maturity has on CVSS 4.0. And I'm going to talk about situations in which the exploit maturity metric is useful. I called this exploit maturity as your new best friend in CVSS. So I'm going to be a little bit biased in favor of situations where exploit maturity is good because I like to use it. Particularly, this is going to be issues that someone may encounter when they're using CVSS 4.0 and being able to lead someone to a more accurate result or something that they're happier with whenever you're using exploit maturity. The talk is not about CVSS 3.1 versus CVSS 4.0 in general. If you have been in room 8 today, you have seen those talks over and over and over again, and everyone would probably be very mad at me if I did that for the, I think, 5th time. CVSS 4.0 in general. Also, there are other talks today that went over CVSS 4.0 in general, and they were great talks. But I should not be repeating the work that has already been done today. And I am not going to go into exploit code maturity in CVSS 3.1. This is specifically about if you are going to use CVSS 4.0 and mostly issues specific to CVSS 4.0. With those groundwork laid out, what is exploit maturity? To quote the first documentation about what exploit maturity is, this metric measures the likelihood of the vulnerability being attacked and is based on the current state of exploit techniques, exploit code availability, or active in the wild exploitation. Whenever you see exploit maturity being used, the shorthand symbol is the letter E. We're going to see the letter E pop up a fair bit in this talk. And specifically, it's the only metric in CVSS 4.0's threat metrics category, which makes it a little different from base score environmental metrics, what were called temporal metrics in CVSS 3.1 and so on. It's unique because it's in its own category. It has 3 levels of severity that I put in order of most bad to least bad. Most bad is attacked. Proof of concept is middle bad, kind of sort of bad. And the unreported level is the least bad. In general, you're going to want things to be less bad when it comes, when possible. We don't always have control over the amount of badness in the world, but in general, we like things to be less bad if possible. Attacked means that the vulnerability has been exploited in the wild. That is why that is the most bad. We do not like it when things get attacked or exploited in the wild. That makes us sad. Proof of concept is less bad. That means a publicly available proof of concept exists, but there's no proof of exploitation occurring in the wild. Unreported is the least bad. That could be a score from a claim as low as there's a vulnerability, just trust me. But unreported means there's not a public knowledge of a proof of concept. There's no public knowledge of exploitation attempts, and that's the least likely to be exploited and the furthest from being exploited. What are some of the problems that we could use this metric with its 3 lovely levels for? I am glad you asked. There is a problem with vulnerability overscoring. What some people feel is vulnerability overscoring in CVSS 4.0 compared to CVSS 3.1. That means there are going to be more critical and high vulnerabilities. And because there are many, many orgs that deal with critical and high vulnerabilities in certain ways, according to their policies, they have to move quickly to act on those vulnerabilities. And that can increase the risk of alert fatigue if all of a sudden you are dealing with a lot of critical vulnerabilities and a lot of high vulnerabilities when all that's really changed about the vulnerabilities is the scoring system that's used about them. In fact, there is a specific post that led me to think about how exploit maturity could help with this problem. And it was a post on Mend by Aurora Starita, which is called CVSS 3.1 versus CVSS 4.0. A look at the data. This is a comparison of CVSS 3.1 scores with similar CVSS 4.0 scores, which found that CVSS 4.0 scores tended to score higher for similar vulnerabilities compared to CVSS 3.1. The quotes that stuck out to me the most were, the average increase across all of the CVSS scores in customer alerts went up by nearly 0.8. That is a 0.8 point, that is almost 1, which resulted in 27% more critical severity alerts and 18% more high severity alerts, which on its own can be quite a lot, but it was large enough to move a large number of CVEs over the line into the next severity level. In case you are not able to read this chart on the screen, there's a text box on the top that says CVSS 3.1 versus 4.0 in men.io customer alerts. The darker blue box on the top is CVSS 3.1. The lighter blue box on the bottom is CVSS 4.0. It goes from critical on the top to low on the bottom. You can see where there is a higher concentration toward the top and the light blue bars, and there is less of a concentration toward the top and the dark blue bars. There are those situations where the CVE gets bumped over into the next severity level. And it's possible to see this severity level bump happen with specific examples. Here is a fairly typical example of something that I see from the CVE feed in my everyday work. This would be a denial of service attack by an authenticated user, so that would be privileges required low. Your typical unauthenticated, uncomplicated denial of service attack lands on a 6.5 or medium in CVSS 3.1. That same authenticated denial of service attack with low complexity lands you on a 7.1 or high if you use CVSS 4.0. However, if that vulnerability hasn't been exploited in the wild, there are ways to get that down to something that would be more of what people expect in CVSS 4.0. For example, if you use A for attacked, it's still at 7.1 or high, but more commonly you are dealing with something that has no evidence of exploitation in the wild, whether that's something where someone says there's a vulnerability, just trust me, or there's some proof of concept code floating around. You can lower it to P for proof of concept or U for unreported. P for proof of concept results in 5.7 or medium, which is pretty close to the CVSS 3.1 6.5, or a 4.9 medium, which is, it's not low, but it's still like a lower medium, and it's closer to what most people would expect when they see an authenticated denial of service compared to this 7.1 or high. Something that's a little bit less standard, an information disclosure vulnerability with some non-standard settings in there, what in CVSS 3.1 would be called high complexity. That would be a medium severity vulnerability in the world of CVSS 3.1 with a score of 6.8, and that would be all the way up to 8.2 with a difference of 1.4 points in CVSS 4.0. However, once again, if there's no proof that this vulnerability with non-standard settings involved has been exploited in the wild, you can get it down much closer to what someone would expect using proof of concept or unreported. If you use proof of concept, that gets it all the way down to 6.9. So it's a high medium. It's a shade below high, but it's still what most people would be expecting to see, or a more medium at 4.6 if that's an unreported vulnerability. Those are a couple of situations where you can help calm people down a little bit by saying, hey, this hasn't been exploited in the wild. Very few vulnerabilities in the grand scheme of things have solid proof of being exploited in the wild. But this helps to assess the downstream consumer's expectations of how serious this is, based in part on whether it's been exploited in the wild. That's something that's really nice and reassuring, that you can say there's no proof of exploitation in the wild, or there's proof of concept code out there. You can go replicate it yourself if you want, but there's no evidence of threat actors actually using this vulnerability. But Shelby, I hear you all ask, there are those situations where vulnerabilities actually have been exploited in the wild, and that's pretty serious. Shouldn't we be talking about those situations where people actually want to say this is serious because this vulnerability has been exploited in the wild? And oh boy, I am glad that you asked, because there are so many lovely, wonderful things that you can use to warn people that a vulnerability has been exploited in the wild. You can use the Known Exploited Vulnerabilities Database. They're pretty trustworthy. If something's on KEV, it's been exploited. If you don't want to go quite as far as KEV, there is EPSS, which is also a lovely tool, and which also has folks talking about it at this fine conference, in which past exploitation can be a factor in EPSS scoring, but past exploitation is not the only factor when it comes to EPSS. Or you can put evidence of exploitation, or whether or not something's been exploited before, right in the CVSS. And you don't need any other scores or numbers in the record, just that CVSS. And in fact, this was something that I did when I helped a maintainer who was concerned about the use of CVSS 3.1 for their product. This was someone who came to us in the public advisory database repo because a vulnerability that they had some concerns about actually was exploited in the wild, to the tune of, of some pretty serious consequences. And they were concerned that the CVSS 3.1 did not adequately describe how serious this situation actually was. CVSS 4.0 ended up being the right solution for them for a couple of reasons. And I went through the process of rescoring the vulnerability with them, first trying with CVSS 3.1. I tried rescoring with CVSS 3.1, but if I just tried what they suggested, one of the things they said was this vulnerability can brick something. Okay, bricking is pretty serious. That sounds like a high availability issue. But after everything they told me, the highest I could still get it to was from 6.5 medium to 8.7 or high. And that was serious enough. They weren't happy with just high. Like with the seriousness of the attack and the losses involved, critical really felt more appropriate to them. And I thought, well, what can we do with CVSS 4.0? And with CVSS 4.0, there were a couple of important changes, not just exploit maturity. In addition to adding subsequent system impacts, in addition to vulnerable system impacts, and adding E:(A), we were able to get the CVSS up to 9.1 or critical. And that was actually what made the maintainers happy, because in that score, this was able to warn them, both A, your device is going to be bricked, and B, this has happened in the wild. We were able to show all of that information with just the CVSS. And in fact, this worked out pretty well. I'd like to quote myself because I am pretty proud of how I handled the situation. So for the benefit of those who may not be able to read the small text, and for the benefit of myself who likes to read her own words, knowing there's an availability impact definitely impacts the score. Breaking constitutes a high impact, so I think it's appropriate to set the availability value to high. Additionally, I think there's an argument to be made for scope change based on the bug, not just allowing account access, but allowing exfiltration of money/data from one account to another. Therefore, I will correct the CVSS scores to I provided 3.1 and 4.0. In this case, CVSS 3.1 is still assessed as high, but CVSS 4.0 is assessed as critical, and I think CVSS 4.0 is a better fit due to having more specific information about the impact on vulnerable versus subsequent systems and information about the exploit maturity. Do these scores look reasonable to you? I'm interested in adding CVSS 4.0 to the advisory and the CVE record. The maintainer came back. Shelby, much more reasonable now. And we all lived happily ever after, because I did, in fact, update the advisory and update the CVE record. And nowadays, people can see that CVE 2023 39363 was exploited in the wild. They can see it on CVE.org. It's right there in the CVE record. It's tiny text on a tiny image, but trust me, it's there. You can go there and check. You can see it on NVD if you go to the NVD record for CVE 2023 39363. EA. It's right there. All they need is a CVSS to see that it was exploited. And the global GHSA. You can go to the GitHub Advisory Database, see the CVSS. It is right there. And it was beautiful. Now that we're coming up on the top of the hour, it's time where I should let you all know what you want to do if you want to learn more about this. Sadly, this is the last CVSS talk at VulnCon 2025, and there are no more anticipated for the next couple of days. Only some of the talks have been recorded, and once they go live, you can see them. But I attended the talks by Mr. Arnold and Mr. Liali and Mr. Cho and Dr. Zhang and Ms. Zhang earlier today, and I can reassure you that they were all fantastic, and there are a lot of great talks happening at VulnCon this year. I also consulted first documentation on CVSS 4.0 when writing this talk to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding anything about any of the metrics, and it is a fantastic resource. And the Aurora Starita blog post has some interesting data, and I've seen some similar data and similar conclusions by the folks who gave talks here. And that post helped me with this talk as well. And now that we've reached the end, those folks who need to get going, you all are welcome to get going. But I'm going to be around for a while. I'm happy to answer questions. So if anyone in the audience has questions, or if anyone on Discord has questions, I'll be around for a while. We can chat a little longer. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, so I was curious, is the expectation now that CVSS scores for version 4 will be updated when there's an exploit that occurs later?
It depends. I would say it, I would say it depends on the CNA. And in the case of GitHub as a CNA, it's important for us to, I hesitate to say be the maintainer's voice, but we do want to make sure we are accurately representing the maintainer's perspective on the vulnerability. And in the case of this particular maintainer, it was very important for people to know that this issue had been exploited and that they had gone to certain lengths to fix it. So they were very interested in getting the word out there. It's not a necessity if someone doesn't want that information out there, but in this case it was, it was important, and that was nice to have that tool available to help them with their message.
So now that there's a field that indicates the level of exploit attacks in the wild, attacks happening, what implications does that have for like the duplicity with like CISA KEV?
I think that KEV still has its place because, sometimes you do want to start with finding something that has been exploited in the wild rather than starting with learning about a product and then going on to see if it's exploited in the wild. I still think that it's very valuable to have those specific scores, but especially because exploit maturity isn't part of the CVSS base metrics, and there are those organizations that use tools that don't recognize anything after the base metrics. So you still have space for those tools that it's either a binary yes, no, it's been exploited, or it's something like EPSS where it's more of a probability score.
So this talk was wonderful. I love to see EPSS 4 kind of used dynamically and not just taken as canonical. So it's really great that GitHub's doing this. I may be fishing for an answer here. Do you think the EPSS SIG erred in making the default for exploit attacked? You can also have a diplomatic answer, and that's okay.
I wouldn't say it's an error because it depends on the perspective you're coming from. And traditionally, CVSS has come from a perspective, like in particular, when you're talking about something. I know NVD is not the same thing, but when you're talking about NVD or other more general data providers having a policy of assuming a worst case scenario, then assuming a worst case scenario is a reasonable decision. And quite frankly, as vulnerability data gets older and time goes on, it can be more difficult to suss out whether something has been exploited in the wild or not. So it may be more appropriate to assume the worst case scenario and bring it down rather than less serious and bring it up. But it depends on your philosophy toward these things. I think that in general, it's better on the enrichment side to err toward, including that information rather than not including it. But Yep.
Okay, so one question from my side would be, you mentioned that, in response to even the first question, who is supposed to fill this exploit code maturity field in the CVSS, in your opinion?
So this would largely be the CNA. I think that granted the CNA, although if a in my case, in my job, if a maintainer came and said, you know, we know there's been an exploit in the wild and we want to include this, I would be fine. Or if they said, you know, there's a proof of concept, but no proof of exploitation in the wild, I would be fine with including that. But if your CNA is an org, you know, where they handle their own products and they're not dealing with things on the open source side, then that would be something that the org would have to decide.
Yeah, actually, this is where my confusion stems from, because first of all, the CVSS 4.0 documentation clearly says this field has to be filled by the consumer of the CVSS, which I
Yeah.
also agree to,
Yeah.
because this is like, yeah, it's a threat intel information or something which you at a consumer end can actually enrich the CVSS with.
Yeah.
Because if you say now the CNA has to fill this information, then they need to know, okay, every vulnerability where it is exploited in the wild or something, or if there is a proof of concept available or not. So that confused me a bit. Like, is CNA now supposed to know all this and then fill this field?
Now that's a little bit rough because GitHub exists in an interesting place in CNA land because we are both a producer of CVE information and a downstream consumer of CVE information. So we operate with a foot in both worlds. It's probably more of a clear answer when your org is one or the other. So for those of you who are watching online, there were two questions that that I could hear, but the microphone sounds like it didn't pick up. And the first one was, is there a hard deadline for stopping use of CVSS3? And I saw two heads very vigorously shaking no.
We will come for you if you don't move to version 4. I will, in the dead of night, I will change all your scores to version 4.
Yeah.
No, of
And
course not.
the second question was is there anyone using exploit maturity in CVSS3? And the answer is no, because exploit maturity was introduced in 4.0. There is a similar concept called exploit code maturity in 3.1, but it works differently than 4.0, and I deliberately didn't include it in the talk. Oh. That is a good question. For some GitHub security advisories, I know that there are some where we use 3.1 and 4.0 alongside exploit maturity. A lot of times this is done in order to provide more concordance between the CVSS 3.1 and CVSS 4.0 scores. A pretty common example is the example that I showed earlier of the authenticated denial of service vulnerability where let's see, where is it? The authenticated denial of service vulnerability where folks would be expecting to see something that's moderate, but if we have a proof of concept but no proof of exploitation in the wild, assessing it as high severity to a lot of people would be an overscore because they're expecting to see medium based on their experience with CVSS3. So this is a situation and I would say a not uncommon situation to use something like E proof of concept or E unreported to make a CVSS 3.1 and a CVSS 4.0 score in better alignment. Thanks. Are there any questions from the Discord? Oh, sorry. We have an in-person question.
Like the idea of the exploit maturity component. The thing that actually worries me is it's not being applied consistently. Like if it's an optional metric, if you're evaluating all your risk, it should be on everything. And otherwise you're basically you're cherry picking. It's like you said, you think this should be critical and you were finding a way to justify it, which again, I'm not saying it's not, but if you're not applying the same standard to everything and considering the exploit maturity as a standard component, it might skew your overall evaluation of the vulnerabilities in your environment. And like I said, if it's going to be included, great. If the CNAs are going to include it, great. But if it's only applied sometimes when certain things are needed, it kind of skews a lot of stuff. Sometimes good, sometimes not so. So just a comment on the example.
I think that's a fair perspective to have, and one of the things that's a little bit difficult for me in terms of consistency is that in my work, we have to deal with such a broad variety of software. And it turns out finding like one scoring system for assessing vulnerabilities in all software is pretty hard. So some squishiness and some level of inconsistency is somewhat inevitable. But that's a fair comment to say that it would be nice to have more consistency.
So I have another question about the intended usage of that metrics in your domain. So coming from a Cyber Resilience Act perspective, where they specifically say like there's a vulnerability that is exploited with malicious intent, and then you have reporting applications. Did you or do you consider to encounter something like that as kind of a malicious intent? Because kind of as a CNA, when we find code on GitHub, that kind of you download it, you run it, that's still kind of a proof of concept type of thing versus the we did not see it as malicious intent. Is there anything that your statement is when this is set by GitHub, our reporting obligations should trigger? Maybe also asking a nation state?
Yeah, that's difficult to say because I've never been in a situation where someone disagrees about whether or not something has been exploited in the wild, and I came from the perspective of a maintainer says this has been exploited in the wild and they believe this is serious. That's interesting on the security researcher side. I don't have as much experience with the security researcher side, and what if the security researcher says this has been out there? That's a really good question, but I think the question also arises when you're talking about things like KEV. At what point is it considered a known exploited vulnerability? Okay, it's a little bit after. I'm happy to continue the conversation, but it is now a little bit after the hour, so I think we have to wrap up.